well, thank you very much for your patience. It's a great honor to be back in Michigan. I'm really honored by the chance to be part of the Medical Ethics Resource Network, or MERN, of Michigan meeting, as well as this really splendid event that we've just heard described, how much all of us are going to learn as a result of this conference. And a chance to see old friends here is an added pleasure. The presentation this morning is a joint project. My colleague Arlene McDonald, and would Arlene please be recognized? And this is the person who helped me greatly. She's our new addition to our group in Galveston this past year, coming to us from University of Toronto in religious studies and anthropology of religion. And we've divided up the material, and the way you'll know even though I'm going to present here, is that if it makes sense, that probably means that that's Arlene's contribution to the talk. So first I'm going to say a few things about bioethics, because there may be some people who have not closely attended to the development over the past 4 decades of this field in the United States. So this will be a very superficial and very, very quick attempt to get us sort of all at the same page about what we're talking about when we talk about bioethics. So a lot of people think that at least before the 1960s, we had what you might call the old medical ethics. And this was often relied on oaths and codes such as the Hippocratic Oath or the Code of Ethics of the American Medical Association. It was assumed at that time that only practitioners of medicine were competent to address ethical issues in medicine. So imams, philosophers, social scientists, lawyers were not welcome. They obviously didn't know anything about medical practice, so go away and leave it to the doctors to talk about ethics, if they ever did. It was assumed at much of this time that a paternalistic attitude toward the patient was the right way to do medicine. So phrases like doctor knows best or following doctor's orders captured that sense of medical paternalism. And there were no formal courses in medical ethics in the vast majority of medical schools. It was assumed that you learned this by example. You watched your senior professors, who of course were complete paragons of virtue, and that would be what ethics was. So we got tired of this around the 1960s as part of the general sort of anti-authoritarian social upheaval of that time, some people think. And so the first wave of the new bioethics rode on the back of interest in ethical principles. I'm sorry, went too far here. So basically, the feeling of that time is that the complex problems of the new medicine, organ transplants, intensive care units, resuscitation, etc., required input from scholars in multiple fields, including ethics, law, and policy. Now, it's important to remember that the first wave of these scholars coming into bioethics actually came from religion. But they were soon supplanted and pushed out of the way by philosophers who pretty much then took over the show and sort of marginalized for some time input from the religious traditions. And the sort of big discovery of the day that everybody got excited about was the discovery of the primacy of patient autonomy, the idea that patients have rights and values that need to be respected. And so we ended up with ideas like informed consent and ideas like the right to refuse treatment, even in the case of life-prolonging therapy. Now, since the 1970s and 1980s, there's been some further development of the field. So the focus in the early days on principles like the principle of respect for patient autonomy, which are thought to be abstract, general, and universal concepts, has been criticized increasingly as one and not the sole approach to the field of bioethics. As part of this criticism of what some call principlism, there's been a turn in bioethics, I would argue, toward the greater appreciation for the particular and the local in ethical thinking. And this has led to the door opening better for less reliance on philosophical ethics and more attention to the social sciences, movements such as feminism and narrative approaches and cultural studies. And once again, I think religion is seen as being more welcome as a contributor to the dialogue when we're not so fixated on what's general and what's universal as we are on the local and the particular. So with this extremely superficial account, let me now turn to the initial question, which I think is posed by this conference. What can Islamic religion, history, and culture teach today's bioethics, particularly as we heard in the US context? And this is not the question that I will address. I'm going to talk as a way of setting the stage for that real question of the conference. I'm going to try to set the stage by talking about the more general question of how should bioethics think about religion. And basically what we're going to present this morning is very much a view from 35,000 feet. And later in the conference will be, as you hear, going down to ground level. And we'll descend to lower altitudes twice during this talk. But generally, this is what you're going to get, is the view from above. And hopefully this will help in terms of our later discussion of the real world. So basically what we set out to do is we argue that some misconceptions get in the way of bioethics thinking about religion in the most helpful way. And these misconceptions basically fall under two categories. Some have to do with what we think religion is, and some have to do with how we see the role of religion in a diverse democratic society. So those are the two big divisions of what I'm going to be presenting here. So first of all, let's talk about what is religion. Well, the view that we're going to be critical of is what we think is a set of common views about religion. Religion is a body of relatively static, fixed theological teachings, that religion is a tradition that shapes the beliefs and actions of its adherents, that religion is separate and distinct from the secular realm, and this funny phrase that I'll talk about a little bit, modernity's irrational remainder. Basically what this phrase means is that in pre-modern times, human beings were mentally very primitive. We believed in magic and superstition. Then modern times came along and we got science and we got rationality. But it didn't completely take over, and what's left from the old days of magic and superstition, that's what we call religion. Okay? So you've already heard in the lovely introduction we've had the criticism of several of these views. So what we're going to do is try to develop a little more deeply an alternative way of thinking about religion that we hope will be better than these common, but we believe misconceived ways of thinking. So now let's say, does this have anything to do with real life, or is this purely a theoretical debate? So descending quickly from 35,000 feet to a lower altitude, let's look at a particular example of how bioethics might go wrong, where the way it goes wrong, I think, is traceable to those four ways of thinking about religion. So transplant advocates discover that organ donations are rare among the members of a particular religious community. So the advocates immediately go to the book. They go to the theology, they read the theology, and they discover that there are no prohibitions of organ donation in the holy book, whatever that is for that particular religious group. They then go to the community and say, we've got news for you guys. There is no, the organ donation is permissible according to your religion, so get in line and give your organs, please. Sign up. They don't. There's no change. The bioethicists, the advocates, then assume, boy, are those people primitive, superstitious, and backward. There's no way to reason with those people. And so they turn their backs and go off to do good somewhere else. So we would argue that what's going on here is shaped by, this comes from some of Arlene's work on organ transplantation in Canada. And this is an example, I think, where the wrong conceptions of religion shape problems that crop up in the real world when people think they're doing a good thing, and maybe if they'd taken a little different perspective, there could have been a better communication and maybe some better results. So here's what we're going to propose. Instead of thinking about religion, and this is a view that is basically grounded in sociology and anthropology of religion, which we're going to argue that for bioethics purposes in no way ought to replace theological studies, but definitely should supplement theological studies. So instead of thinking of religion solely as a body of theological teaching, we want to talk about what does it mean to think instead about lived religious experience. Instead of assuming that tradition is what shapes beliefs, we'll want to suggest that maybe it's helpful to think about this lived religious experience being shaped by multiple cultural inputs. Instead of imagining a sharp distinction between the secular and the religious, we want to suggest that maybe these are constructed categories and contested categories, that they talk back and forth all the time, argue back and forth all the time, and an awful lot of interesting stuff happens at the boundary. Finally, instead of this really sort of insulting idea of modernity's irrational remainder, we'd like to talk about continuously evolving religiosity that participates in and is part of either modernity or postmodernity, as you wish. So let's talk about those four ideas that we think are improved ways for bioethics to engage in thinking about religion. The idea of lived religious experience admits and acknowledges, as I hope I've made clear, that theological study is important and valuable and cannot be replaced. But it should be supplemented by careful attention to the lived experiences of ordinary individuals, some of which converge with and some of which may depart from certain elements of orthodox instruction. And the bottom line here that I think is very helpful to keep in mind, merely knowing one's religious denominational affiliation may be a poor guide as to what one believes and how one experiences religiosity in one's life. So getting us back to the people's experiences, the people's lived experiences, the people's beliefs on the ground is something that I think we need to be reminded of the importance of. Now, the next concept we want to suggest as a helpful way to think about religion and its contributions to bioethics is the idea of multiple cultural inputs. So the religious identities of both individuals and communities, according to this view, are constantly in conversation with lots of things, which we don't often think of under the heading of religion. But media, popular culture, even advertising is part of what religion and religiosity is constantly in conversation with. Law and policy, as we'll talk about here, literature, economics, global flows of information, globalization generally, political ideologies, and, not the least, medicine and science. Another descent from 35,000 feet. I believe it's possible today to hire people at a fairly sizable rate who will come into your hospital and they will teach you about cultural competency. And as part of their teaching about cultural competency, they will get up before the group and they will say, if your patient is a Sunni Muslim, here's what they think. Here's what they believe. And the question is that cultural competency? Now, according to the old view, maybe that would be cultural competency. According to the view we're advocating, it's a start. It gets you somewhere. But where do you want to end up? You don't want to stop there. Where you want to end up is, are our ears properly attuned to multiple kinds of moral discourse with a deepened respect for the range of human experience and choice? So I think what we're saying here is the same thing. Are you going to be told that in order to have cultural competency, you need to know the Islamic view? Or are you going to be told these are some Islamic views? What's going to be true cultural competency?